It's my pleasure to invite Andrew to guide us through this workshop. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, everybody. It's a real privilege to be with you today, and I hope that my comments can be helpful. All right, so I was a little bit late. I was still working on my slides, and Shazia reminded me, oh, it's 3 o'clock. So I ran, so that's why I'm a little bit late, so I apologise for that. So I'll manage this time accordingly from now. I wanted to start with some background, and I don't know if you can read that, but this is basically my view on academia at the moment. So there's these real alternative visions, and I think we're just at a precipice or a point, depending on how positively or negatively you view academia at this moment. So on the one hand, academia is this ideal life where we're just trying to create knowledge to make the world better and live a life of service through a life of the mind. That's what academia is all about. And that might have encouraged you to go into academia, to stay in academia, to be a scholar and so forth. However, academia is also a huge machine, and there's a big risk that we're just feeding the machine and it's just getting bigger and bigger and we're just feeding it and feeding it. Then you're, as PhD students, I think, stuck in the middle between these visions, living both of them, thinking about both of them, trying to hopefully find mentors to guide you through this. Now, one part of this is reviewing, which is what I'm going to be talking about today, but this weaves into every aspect of academia. So hopefully it's something that you're thinking about and that other mentors are coaching you on and reflective of too. All right, in terms of background on reviewing, much of our job is reviewing. When you think about it, so much of our time is just reviewing. In fact, I do so much reviewing sometimes I think, who am I to be reviewing other people's things, because I can't get anything done myself. I'm just reviewing other people's things all the time. So just as an example, I know that on my contract or somewhere something is written about that I'm supposed to do roughly 40-40-20, 40 research, 40 teaching, 20 service. But if I just thought of the last few days, last week, it was much more 10, 15, 75. 10% research, 15% teaching, I'm teaching a class this semester, and 75% service, where most of that is reviewing of various sorts. So I did 2 senior editor reports for MI's Quarterly. I still carry a load at that journal. I did 10-year promotion letters for some colleagues overseas. That takes a lot of time to do it well. I was on various award committees for my association. I did some grant reviews and I wrote some reference letters, and that took up a large chunk of the week. And that's just like always. That's just constant. No, it goes in ebbs and flows, but so much is just reviewing. And then there's lots of other reviews on top of that. I might do a school review or a departmental review. I participate in PhD milestones. I was doing an external PhD exam recently. I was on recruiting committees. You may not think of that as review, but basically it's like reviews. We just look through someone's package, we put it into a pile, say this is good, this one's not so good. It's all various sorts of reviewing. So maybe to just start with some discussions, like, why do we review so much? Why is so much of what we do just reviewing? So what do you think? Does it make sense that someone would employ someone like me and I'm just reviewing all the time? And I'm not alone. That's what academics do a lot. So does it make sense? Why do we review so much? Yeah.
Would it not be a cycle that there's a lot of PhD students or academics pressure to create more outputs? Those outputs need to be evaluated.
Yeah.
And so it creates more need for reviews, which then creates to basically assess those outputs.
Sure. So why can't it just be assessed by some market out there? Like why can't we just produce stuff, put it out in the world? Why do we need to take up so much time? Yeah, reviewing.
Maybe it can almost be seen like an unbiased type of collaborating.
Yeah.
Because you're unbiased and you're helping someone,
Mm-hmm.
improving the quality of their work, but without being involved.
Okay, yeah. So there's sort of some, so like Krishna's thing was just supply is increasing, right? There's more and more supply, and the new one would be there's some quality process in that supply process. Along the research workflow, there's quality control and input at various stages. You don't have to have your name on it, you're just helping the quality process. So that's another one. What's something else? Yeah.
In the writing structure, because sometimes people talk about something that is not exactly related to the subject, you want to make it written.
Okay. So actually I'll build on these two things. So one was quality and one was structure. You're going to make another point, I think.
Yeah, maybe because it forces you to also stay on top of the field. Because if you're reviewing, you're already well informed about what you're saying, and it actually forces you to.
So that's true. So there may be a personal incentive actually to, yeah. So I'll get to that in a second. On the previous two, the quality and the structure one thing that's interesting there is are there objective characteristics of what is good or bad in research? Who feels that research is very objective? Like, there's good research, there's bad, like, it's kind of obvious. Who thinks it's more subjective? Yeah?
Yeah, it is subjective. Like, you can have a paper rejected in one place and you just resubmit with nothing else and you get accepted and then equally valued than you.
Yeah, so that does happen. Like, even within a community and even within a field, the same kind of conference, one can be rejected, one can be accepted. However, certainly across fields, we would think, oh man, that's very subjective. Like, there's just certain norms and practices that occurred within that field that people value it like this. And you write like this, and you talk like this, and papers look like this. And if you've come from another field and you don't know the language, you don't know the quality criteria, you're just at a complete loss. Like, so you can be way brighter than everyone else in the room and have no ability to publish in that field, kind of thing. So, yeah, academia is like a craft and or a guild, and crafts and guilds have operated for thousands of years, and they depend on people, like the master craftsmen or whatever, and they just review and give mentor. So that's what science is like, right? And it's probably relevant for a group like this because, you know, I don't know, maybe you can use things like AI to actually improve the process, right? Improve the process of science in various ways. But essentially, at the moment, it's a human science, and we depend greatly on reviews. So as you get more senior, you just seem to be reviewing all the time. Now, even though I said I was doing all these reviews, I was doing different types of reviews, and you can imagine reviews vary according to different purposes, like PhD milestones, grants, workshops. So let's say in a PhD milestone, what would be characteristics of good and bad reviews? Anyone been in a milestone and thought, gee, that was good, or gee, that was not so good? Yeah?
It should be more formative and constructive rather than just
Yeah.
decision is important.
Yeah, very developmental, hopefully. Yeah, because it's for learning and training, right? And the summative bit really is out of their control anyway, right? It's an external exam. On the other hand, some strictness could be helpful. So when would some strictness be helpful in a PhD milestones?
Keep you in the right direction.
Yes. Yeah, you might just meander all over the place. So why else? Well, it's similar to the reviewer. Let's imagine, you know, you send a paper to a journal, the journal kills the paper, but later you think, that was probably a good thing that they killed my paper. When would that happen at a milestone? So let's imagine that you're all great students, but let's imagine that someone enrolled in the PhD program and it turned out it wasn't really for them. And yet in every single milestone, the people just said, oh, you know, there's great potential here, just keep going, keep going. And the person is sort of led down the garden path, 3 or 4 something years later, they say, oh, you know, it's not quite good enough, sorry, or you failed your exam. So, you know, if it's not actually somewhat strict enough, then, you know, you'd get a whole bunch of bad science, you're wasting someone's life. You know, so there's certain standards you might want to uphold, right? Grants. How might grants differ from journals, let's say, in terms of reviewing? What might be some experience or thoughts here? You know, you're right. Your performance as an academic may depend on both of these things. So what would reviews look like in grants versus journals, do you think?
I develop this research. But PhD milestone, I will feel is more just we can finish by the timeline 1 year and another year. Grant is more the big picture in the future.
Yeah. So I actually have more success with journals than I do with grants. There's other people here who are very good, much better with grants, and it'd be good to get their advice. My general experience has been that grants I think of as a pitch to a broad audience. Whereas journals, and actually PhDs as well, is persuasive text for a narrow audience. So, in fact, with a journal paper, if I'm editing or reviewing the paper, it doesn't really matter how big a pitch it is. If it's not persuasive, like that it's good research, it's definitely going to get rejected. Almost more, because I think they're setting up a big picture which they can't carry through on. And yet with a grant, if it's like super persuasive, detailed, but the pitch is uninteresting, well then it gets rejected. So, and the pitch for a grant is a very broad audience, and could be anybody reviewing this thing, whereas journals, ideally you've got experts in this area who are reviewing it, right? So the nature of the reviews, the nature of the things are very different. And then how would it vary by discipline? So maybe can you just shout out here what disciplines you're in? Like who's in computer science, roughly? Okay, handful. Business fields, another handful. Engineering. Okay, so it's first a very broad audience. The sciences. Nobody. Medical or clinical? Nobody. There's also another null set of people. All right, so I'm sure it varies though across your different fields, right? So one example, I remember I used to work in Canada before coming back here, and I wanted to do a review of a particular topic, and I knew this topic was studied in business and computer science, so I wanted to do a review. I wanted to include a table in my paper that said I'd looked at this topic in the top journals in all these different fields. So I saw my computer science colleague and said, can you tell me what are the top journals I should be looking at? And I remember she just looked at me and said, journals? Surely you'd want to be looking at the top conferences. And it was just a simple example, right? So the outlets and the kind of reviews are going to be different depending on what field you're in because of just these different practices and norms. And then how do you know if you're good at reviews? Do people get feedback on reviews most of the time? Yeah, that's actually a good indicator of reviews. Now, of course, the counter-argument is you're just being asked because many people know you. But over time, that should self-correct. And like many people know you're a bad reviewer, so no one's giving you the reviews. But yeah, you're right. Gradually, reputation builds. Unfortunately, what can happen is that a few people know you very well, and they use and abuse you as a reviewer. They know that you're great, and that they constantly ask you to review. So if your advisor is just constantly sending you papers to review all the time for every conference and every journal, maybe say, hey, I'd like to get some reviews for somebody else as well. Do you know anyone else? I've kind of been doing a lot for you lately. So anyway, I know that happens. Some people do sort of get people to do a lot of reviews for them. All right, in general though, you don't get feedback on your reviews. So that's a major problem. And you learn partly by seeing other people's reviews. So one practice in many fields is that as a reviewer, you'll see the other reviews on the paper that you reviewed. And so you read someone else's review and go, they had some good points that I didn't see, or I kind of like the way they wrote that. I should do that too. Or I can see that the editor used some of their points and they didn't use my points. I wonder why. Maybe if I write it a bit differently next time, and then so you sort of learn. But the learning is very gradual, and all of these types of reviews vary. So, for example, I'd probably done about 15 or 20 of these promotion tenure reviews for people until I realised that I kind of should have been writing them differently because I'd never sat in the promotion tenure committee and seen how they use these letters. And so one simple thing now is I always make sure I include a pithy kind of quote or something because I know that they're going to take that and stick it in their letter for the next level up the chain. So little practices like this, it just takes you a while to learn. All right, so this is going back to your point over there. Why do you review? So one benefit is that you help. Like that should be the main reason we're reviewing, right? We're trying to help. That's as simple as that. Second is you learn. You learn from reading papers and reviewing. And third is kind of connected to your point about networks. So you become part of a community. So gradually, well, in fact, in Australia, depending on your department and your university, this notion of external letters may or may not be necessary, but let's say in the US community, in the Asian, like Singapore, Hong Kong, China, or at least some parts of China community, external letters are really important for getting tenure and jobs and promotions and things. And I remember when I went through that process, the people I asked, or the people whose names I wrote down, were all people I'd done reviews for. Like you just sort of form part of a community and you get certain roles because, well, people know you because you've done all these reviews and so on. And that links to this next one, the career pathways open. And unfortunately, they open for more reviews. So the more you get known, the more you get asked to do things, and so you just end up reviewing all the time. And then the costs are that you have less time to do your own work. So as I said, some days I feel like, oh, who am I to write this thing, this evaluation when I can't do anything? Another thing I have noticed is that you can become egotistical because you do so many reviews, you think, wow, my opinion must be worth a lot. I must be so great. Gee, my points are awesome. So you just start pontificating about things. And so, that can happen. You have to be careful not to do that. And then clearly, if you don't do a good job, you can really hurt someone, and you can also bear significant reputational costs. And pretty much in academia, the number one thing you have, all you have in the end, is your reputation. So you can basically kill your reputation, which then kills everything else, depending, if you do this job badly. All right. Now, I'm not going to go through all the details, but you also, if you do well, it's nice. People reward you and they just say lovely things about you. So, for instance, I was with the one journal, and Sarah Lebovitz, she's at University of Virginia. She was a reviewer of the year a couple of years ago, and everyone just thinks really highly of it. So, we would show this at a conference, and there's Sarah up on a big screen. And another one is Mari. She was an associate editor for the journal, and we put her up and think, well, she's amazing. She's just an incredibly good editor. So, this, like, why do you do it? It's for intrinsic reasons, it should be, but, we celebrate people who are great reviewers, great editors, and so on. All right, when I was asked to talk about reviewing, it was probably in the context of journal conference reviewing and things, even though there's so many other types of reviewing. Now, when you talk about journal reviewing, one interesting question is, should you just assume that journals are static, like they don't change? So the advice I give you now should be the advice I give you next year, which would have been the same advice you got 10 years ago, etc. So there's a good reason to assume that should not be the case, right? Some practices will be the same, but some practices will change. So I don't know if you've ever seen a diagram like this. If you were doing like intro sociology or something at the university, you would see a diagram like this, right? So certain structures or norms affect actions by individuals, but those actions by individuals gradually change structures, right? This is the basic laws of sociology, right? So just like that, we have certain structures or norms in journals, and that affects the way people do things, like authors or reviewers. But the things that authors and reviewers do change gradually the structures. So over time, because of certain innovations that people do, they did a great job, people see, oh, that's a good way of doing things, and they start to change. Or that person who is sort of innovative and doing well becomes an editor, and they start instituting certain practices, and so that journals change over time, right? So we should never just assume that this is static. As a result of this, journals are in flux all the time, so we can look at journals through a design lens. So these are just some articles mostly about how to build your workflow. Point before, there was a paper about that, how people are building new types of journals by rethinking journal workflows or publishing workflows, people looking at how they can use AI to improve journals, how they can create national infrastructures of knowledge, rethinking of the role of journals in this. There's a lovely paper, this was a paper I loved at the time, Semantic Science, which is an old paper now, 2007, but broadly, was well ahead of its time, thinking of how can we change the way in which we document scientific knowledge. You can look at journals through an institutional lens. All the institutions of science are basically trying to improve journals and change journals. There's a whole bunch of debates with journalists, different plans for subsidising and incentivising journals, metrics for journals, open access mandates for journals, changes in the industry of journals, like even October 28th, when it was yesterday, Scholar One was just bought, by Silverchair from Clarivate. So that, we probably, I don't know if your fields use Scholar One, but this is changing all the time. You can look at it through a competition lens. We received an email, so on the left was an email from one of my colleagues. It was around, hey, we should try to publish more in nature-type journals because, that will look good when we go for promotions and things like this. But if you think about it with a competition lens, Nature is just a product brand extension. They're competing in the world of journals. So, if there's research on this topic, there's research on how journals like this are engaging in product and brand extension. So journals are not stable artifacts that just have these norms forevermore. It's constantly changing. You can look at it through a power lens, like the power of people like Web of Science and Scopus, and there's research on how they wield their power for these various metrics and the various positives and negative effects and so on. You can look at it through a transparency lens. So there's all these things beyond journals, the Qualitative Data Repository, Centre for Open Science. There's lots of research on how to make journals more transparent. You can look at it through a practice lens. So there's also research on the craft of journals, the craft of reviewing, the craft of science, etc., etc. You can ultimately then look at it as a work in progress. So science is basically a work in progress, and it's surprising how little we know. So this was an article I particularly liked. I was taking an editorial role, so I took the role in 2021, so I remember reading this paper, and it basically looked at all of the elements of peer review and just, did we have any sort of scientific evidence behind those practices? And the basic conclusion was we didn't have much evidence behind most of these practices. It's all just norms and accepted beliefs. It's the nature of sort of craft work. So just as one example, I was involved in the journal MIS Quarterly, and we were aware of lots of different innovations that we could pursue, like should we be more involved in preprints and early reviews? Should we participate with more things like outside of the journal review process? So you've got the journal, but should you have different archives and other things that are outside the journal that people put their research in? Should we have ways of documenting the research in the paper to enable things like search better, like semantic markup and all this sort of stuff? Should we be curating articles for various reasons, whether human curated or machine curated? When you publish an article, should there be lots of other things that go along with it? So like open reviews, significant statements, promotions of various sorts. How do we deal with open access? So we were aware of all these things, and we went through, as an editorial board, lots of discussions about which one should we do. So we would go through particular initiatives, look at the benefits, whether it made sense, what concerns would be. I won't go through all of them, but you can see, should we have open identities, have open reports? We went through all these things. Should we have interactions between authors, interactions amongst reviewers, more open participations like pre-reviews, commenting on papers, registered reports, result-free. So we went through all these things, and I'll go back. And we ultimately concluded on some of these, so that we would say, we should consider some of these further, and we should not. So one of them we did was the registered reports one, for example. And are you familiar with that idea of registered reports? Is that something that you do in your fields? So has anyone heard of registered reports? Yeah?
Is that the intent that you're going to conduct like a certain experiment and maybe
That's
that you'll
exactly
advise
right.
about the outcomes of
That's
the
right.
to publish negative
That's right. Yeah, exactly. So you say, we could give a conditional acceptance on this paper without you having done the study.
Yeah.
and then you do the study and the results turn out, but we can't reject the paper based on those results. Yeah, we can only reject it on the basis that you didn't do what you said you were going to do. Yeah, that's right. So our journal didn't support that, and then we had a discussion as a journal, say, should we support that? And then the conclusion was, why don't we do it as a test? And so that was, what our journal was doing, but, different journals can do different things. But that means, for this group if it's about reviewing, the way you would review such a paper would be different, right? Because you can't see the results, it's just a proposal. And it turned out that our experience was that people are more risk averse. So they're tougher on those reviews because essentially you're like, well, I want to get them to do a bit more. Like, I don't know, instead of 2 experiments, I'll get them to do 4 experiments because I don't want them to publish a study and it turns out that it really was bad. So they tend to be tough on these papers. So it's kind of interesting as to what the experience for an author is like. So given all of what I said before, so I went through all those slides of, how journals differ, we should therefore expect quite a lot of differences across fields. So the length and details of papers and reviews will be different. Some fields it might, like I do research in business, but I also do a lot of research in healthcare, and I'll write a business information systems paper that's like 50 to 60 pages long, takes me a long time, and my health one is like 5 pages long. And then the reviews are like super long in the information systems one and super detailed, and then the reviews that I get back on my healthcare stuff is like a paragraph, or fix these typos. I don't know, sometimes it's very strange. And it's just because I'm in 2 different fields and the norms are completely different. So, again, for yours, it'll be very different. Number of expected revisions, is there sort of base assumption that you're going to have 3 or 4 revisions of this paper, or is it like one and done in a big conference or something? What people are focusing on will be different in their reviews, methods, theories, impact, so forth. The different roles of people, reviewers, editors, conference chairs, whatever. The degree of support, like if it was a really small sub-community, you would expect there to be sort of more developmental comments. If it's a very big one, you would expect less, broadly because you bear less reputational cost for being mean if everything is open and the person has no recourse. Whereas if it's a small community, people know each other, you would expect greater recourse for bad behaviour, so it generally is better behaviour. There's also going to be different trends, right, in different areas. For example, in the information systems area, one thing that we did was we brought in initiatives around making data available. So if it's an empirical paper, your data should be available for people to review in terms of transparency. That's fairly recent, but in some fields in finance, that's just been an assumption for years that your data file is submitted along with the paper. All right. So now, with all that background, I'll get into specifics about journal reviews in information systems, and some of my examples, just because this is my area of familiarity, will come from MISQ. So for those of you who don't know what this journal is, broadly we look at information systems in organisations, industry, society, and we try to have this conception of, in this field, in information systems, we want the finest scholarship. So it's kind of high standards. That affects the submission, so we get a lot, but we also don't get that many. Some of the second-tier journals would get twice as many submissions as we do. We have roughly 70 editors, 2/3 of them are from the US, that's just the nature of the field. And then it takes between 1 and 5.5 years to get a paper accepted. So the quickest paper would take about a year, and then the longest paper, which is way too long, it should obviously be much faster than that, but the longest paper was about 5.5 years under review. Average is about 2.5 years on average. And then average number of rounds to accept a paper is about 4.5. It should be faster, but that's just what it is. And then average cycle time, so when you submit a paper, you should get the reviews back in around 2 months. Now, I'm not saying these are good or bad. This is just the nature of the field, right? In another field, it could be totally different numbers, but this just gives you a sense for kind of what this is, and it's sort of the culture I'm familiar with. And as a result, with this journal, roughly 3 or 4 of these papers would get you tenure at a good US school. That's kind of how to think about quality, as opposed to, I need 10 papers or 15 papers or 1 paper. Roughly 3 or 4 of these papers would get you tenure. And there's these different categories. So you can submit a paper to the journal and it has these different categories, and each one is reviewed differently. So in your own fields, maybe you have other categories as well or differences. I'm not sure if these are similar to yours, but we broadly have empirical articles, they're called research articles, research notes. So what do you... Are you familiar with the difference between a note and an article? That's probably relatively similar across fields. So at least in the information systems field and at this journal, an article, the difference between an article and a note, an article is when conceptualising the problem itself takes time. Like there's maybe debates or ambiguities about what the problem even is. So it kind of takes you a bunch of pages to describe what the problem is. Now I know what the problem is. This is sort of the solution to the problem or what my contribution is. It's the rest of the paper. With a research note, the problem is given, it's kind of accepted, it's understood. That's the problem I'm addressing, okay, and the paper can proceed. It sort of only takes you a paragraph to get into the paper. That's a research note. So both of them are valuable. They both make the contribution bit. It's just that the problem is well understood already in the note, whereas the problem isn't, requires time and space to set up in the article. So that's the main difference. There's a couple of different categories of a sort of more opinion type papers called commentaries and opinions. And then there's methods articles where there's a contribution to research methods. So again, this may be similar in your fields, that you may have a difference between methods papers and I guess you call them just, empirical or theory papers within the field. What do you think is a key criteria in reviewing methods papers? This probably is similar across fields. So when you review a method paper, what are you often looking for? Novelty? Yeah. I guess when I was going to say this, it's probably similar. It probably depends also on what our definition of methods are, so I should have thought about that. But broadly, like say in our field, we might think of research methods or statistical methods as coming from other fields like statistics or broadly the nature of research design, which might be common across across the social sciences or across the computational sciences and so forth. So there's these agreed methods for doing things, doing research. And it's going to be, somebody might write a paper that's just looks like a contribution to psychometrics or a contribution to statistics in general. And if you read such a paper, you think, well, maybe that should just be submitted to that general journal, like Psych Methods or something. It's a paper on new forms of psychological measurement. So we don't really want to publish that paper in our journal. It's interesting, it looks like it makes a contribution, but let's send it back to Psych Methods. And then, but if it's just a contribution within information systems, then it's not really a methods paper. Like it's just, so there's some balance between the two. So when we review methods papers, we look for some element of a general contribution to, say, some broader methods discipline, and then some contribution to our own field. So they're quite often, you need extra skills typically to review those papers. And then we have these theory papers, and there's often two different types of theory papers. So one, this long phrase here, theory generative research. That's typically, the word synthesis hopefully clarifies it, broadly, where you've done basically a very broad literature review. You reviewed all this literature, you've sort of synthesized and come up with something, a theory, framework, whatever. And then another version, which is really new theory, new framework. Not so much reviewing everybody else, but really coming up with something novel of your own. All right. So let's say when you do reviews, who when you're doing your reviews writes your recommendation in your review? Like, I recommend this paper is accepted or rejected or revised or something. So let's get a show of hands. When you write your review, do you tend to put that in your review? Krishna?
Yeah, I would say, what is it? Revise instead of accept, for instance.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. So you have a role as a reviewer, and often the system forces you to give some guidance, right? There might be a checkbox and you have to check it, accept, reject, revise or something, right? But typically, different fields have different different roles, and the roles have different like authority or requirements, right? So at this journal, we can see on the column for reviewer, the reviewer just gives advice, like the bottom line here. They're giving feedback, they give advice, they don't actually give the recommendation. So in the Scholar One system at MISQ, just simply the way the workflow of the system is set up, you do have to click, accept, revise, but no one takes any notice of that. Like, it's not influential. The author doesn't even receive that advice. And that we don't want the reviewers to say anything in their review about, well, I recommend this is rejected or revised or accepted, because it's not their role. The editors have a role of doing that. The associate editor makes a recommendation. I recommend this paper be accepted, revised, whatever, rejected. But the only person who makes a decision on the paper is the senior editor, and they say revise, reject, etc. And so it's quite possible, it's not common, but it's quite possible that all three reviewers could say reject and the editor says revise or accept. And the other way around, the reviewers could in principle all say accept and the editor says reject. So that would be even less common. But it's certainly not the role of a reviewer to make a decision on a paper. And I know as a doctoral student, I wasn't aware of that. So my first introduction to reviewing was my advisor asked me to do a review for a good journal. And I was super excited, and I wrote this horribly long, detailed review. I thought I was the smartest guy on the planet, coming up with this 6-page pontification about the paper. And then the paper had gone through 2 or 3 rounds, and I remember walking to his office and then double checking with him. And I was like, does a minor revision mean I get to see the paper again versus a conditional accept? It's so embarrassing even thinking that I said this, but it was almost like a power play. I want to see the paper and make sure that they've done what I said they were going to do, what I said they should do, which is super embarrassing. Anyway, I remember him just smiling or just saying he was busy or something like this. And I never saw the next version of the paper. He just accepted it. And, he clearly was wanting to communicate to me without communicating to me that, it was not my place as a reviewer to do this. And, it was his decision. It's like it's not the reviewer who makes a decision on the paper. All right, the reviewing errors, let's imagine that you are sort of worried about accepting a paper. So you're risk averse. What are the different errors? So in our field, we often talk about this type 1, type 2, type 3 error. So a type 1 error is we accept a paper that should be rejected. And so we can solve this by rejecting all papers, right? No paper is good enough. And so this is the mindset of reviewer number 2. Reviewer number 2 has very high standards and always rejects papers. And so they will never have a bad paper get published, or any papers. So then there's a type 2 error where we reject a paper that should be accepted. So this is because of reviewer 2, right? If everyone was negative and there's a paper that should have made a big difference, then that's a bad error. So we can think of that as a type 2 error. And one of the preceding editors-in-chief of this journal had written an editorial. It's quite a nice editorial. You can go and check it out. And lots of Nobel Prize winners have had these papers that have been rejected. We all know those stories that go on to change the world. One thing that we've concentrated quite a lot on in our field is the type 3 error, which is the paper was just the wrong paper. Some of these papers end up getting accepted, but they were never really sort of the right paper. It just became accepted because no one could think of a good reason to reject the paper. Then there's papers that get rejected, and they should be rejected, so they're in the type 3 category. But it was kind of sad that the author just wrote the wrong paper. They've spent years doing this, and it's just usually the main thing is that they've addressed the wrong problem. Like a problem, they've done it well, they've spent years on it, but it just wasn't an interesting enough problem. So the guidelines on reviewing that I'll go through are from the same editor who was concentrating on that type 3 one. and I will go through the different points that he had in this.
Can you explain more about the wrong paper, what you mean?
Yeah. So maybe it goes back to my view before about science as a craft or like a guild. And so there are conceptions in the field about what are the interesting problems or what are what's the right way of doing the research. And unless you spend time learning those norms and learning those beliefs, you can sort of set yourself on a path that seemed good to you, maybe seemed good to your advisor at the time, but it was just never set up to succeed in this journal. So you've sort of, yeah, you've just framed it for the wrong, and written it for the wrong community, or yeah. So one simple example, I remember spending an entire summer. This is when I was an assistant professor in Canada, and it was my best ever paper. I spent the entire summer perfecting the paper once I'd already done it. And anyway, all the reviewers rejected it, and the editor said I'd lost the reviewer by page 2. And it was just because I was writing it for myself. In my view, it was the best paper, but for nobody else. Like, I didn't understand who I was writing it for, and in that community, it was sort of I'd written the wrong paper. So these are guidelines on writing a review, and some of these are really basic. So state your expertise and focus your review. So in our yeah.
I have a question about the previous slide.
Oh yeah.
No, the other.
Yeah.
Is there like a number for like a number of articles for a particular issue that you have in mind? For example, like a target number?
Oh yeah. No. Yeah. Actually, that's interesting. So a journal can, like when we here, like these, just that yeah. No. So the journal just produces research as a function of the decisions that are made by editors. And as an editor, actually, you're kind of wondering, like how many will we accept, or how many are coming through? It's at different journals, they run it differently. At some journals, there's like one person who makes all the decisions. The top journals in our field, it's delegated, so there's an editor-in-chief, and then there's senior editors, they make the decisions, and you're just, the journal is producing what these editors accept, and there may be, in this case, there's 30 senior editors around the world, and if everyone had a review or 2 months ago, you'd end up with no papers. And by then, in fact, it's too late, because you would have no papers for the next issue as well, because it takes time to get these things through the system. So you're sort of working on the assumption that just broadly things are going through, and that's why it's super important. And there's a lot of kind of internal cultural building and I guess internal quality control as to who gets these positions, because you're sort of dependent on them. But the only exception to that is special issues. So this this list doesn't include special issues, and in special issues, like a bad special, in our field, if you had a special issue with more than 10 papers, that would be a very big special issue. It would be surprising to have more than 10. And then if it was under, let's say, 4 papers, that would be considered like, that was a failed special issue. You didn't really get any papers published. This is just a norm. I guess in other fields it could be different, but that's in our field. And what do you think happens then for reviewing or editing behaviour in that kind of context, a special issue? Where editors are sort of, they have a number in mind roughly as to what they...
I guess that they adapt to that number?
They do adapt. And so what happens is they, because it's basically now a smaller set, so the normal one, it's a big set. People can submit a paper at any time. It's the decisions that are occurring under, let's say, someone's role as editor-in-chief are the function of papers that were submitted several years ago. These are just coming through the system at any time. With a special issue, you're the editor in charge of that special issue. You get, like, let's say, 100 papers submitted to that special issue. You know all those papers. You're responsible for all of them. And then the first round comes around, and you know you're supposed to end up with around about somewhere between 5 and 10. So you're really, really harsh on the first round, because you don't want to have 90 papers published in this special issue, because you're going to look like an idiot. That's what they're going to feel like. And then what happens is everyone has this view, and so you basically kill all the papers. And so you get about 15 papers in the second round, and you think, oh my goodness, how am I going to get like 7 of these through? Like even the ones that, 15 papers left, everyone's saying horrible things about them. So what happens is that there's this brutal first, second round, and then by the last round, everyone's like, yeah, this paper's got lots of problems, but let's just accept the damn thing. And so the papers end up going through really quickly. That's my experience with special issues. So then the flip side is for an author, should he submit to a special issue? Well, in some ways, yeah, because you'll find out pretty quickly if your paper's going to get rejected. And if it gets through that, well, it's a pretty good chance it'll get accepted. Yeah. So that's kind of how it works. Yeah. But for the regular papers, it's, not like that. All right. So these ones are fairly straightforward. So state your expertise and focus your review. So you may say, for instance, I am not an expert on this theory that you're using, or I'm not an expert on this method, and you would say that. Or a very typical thing I would say is, because I don't feel comfortable saying I'm just simply not an expert and I cannot comment on it, because that sounds like, you're negligent. So I would say, I am not an expert on this theory or method. I therefore read the following papers to sort of bring myself up to speed on it, and I list the papers that I've read. And so then the author or editor might look at that and say, okay, first of all, he's being honest about what he's not got expertise in, but those papers are good papers, or those papers only capture a part of the theory. And then the author might say, okay, I know those papers as well, and the reviewer's sort of looking at it through this mindset, not through this other one, and that might be helpful for them to know. So I would indicate, what I'm focusing on, what I've got expertise in, and then if I don't have expertise, what I've read, and I would, let's say, I've got the review, it's due Wednesday, I might spend Monday, read a bunch of papers on that area, and they're the ones I'm going to mention in my review that I've read. And then I'd also, if I really just can't review the paper, I would indicate that I just simply don't know this and I can't do the review. But if I was at a good journal, if I was asked to do the review, even if there was lots of parts I didn't understand, historically I would very rarely decline the review. I would just say I will read everything and spend an extra week learning stuff before I do the review to be good at it. That was sort of the attitude I took. All right, refrain from signal jamming. What do you think that means? Focus on issues that make signal jamming. That was just a phrase Arun, who wrote this editorial, wrote when he was just like, there's so many different points you're raising, the author can't tell like what to focus on. So it's signal jamming. So just focus on a few main issues and just leave other things out. So keep a clear signal. And then substantiate claims. So don't just say, the other papers have done this too and you don't give any references, or you've misunderstood this method without saying why they've misunderstood it or giving some backing for why they've misunderstood it. So always say, well, look, you've done this differently, but I've seen these other papers that have done it like this, and theirs looks better than this. There's a weakness with this method. See this other paper that's shown this weakness, and this is what you can do to correct the weakness. So the more substantiation you give, the better. Give suggestions. So substantiate claims and suggestions. Rather than just saying, you should do this, you might say, one way of doing it would be to do this, and here's an example of a paper which has done that, and you can see in this paper that it's like this, and it had this, benefit from doing it. So you're giving these helpful suggestions. You advocate for good work. So often in a review, when I was doing reviews, I would say, or I'd say to myself, I'm going to put more effort on this review because I think this paper should be accepted. It would be super cool if this paper was accepted for the field. I'm worried that the editor may not be totally getting it, so I'm going to put more in my review to help the editor publish this paper. And so that would be sort of advocating for work. On the flip side, you don't want this to be, you think this would be super cool, so you think of it now almost like your paper, and you're trying to get the author to say certain things, and it's not their paper anymore. So you shouldn't be kind of ghostwriting the paper or advocating what you believe is right. And one helpful suggestion I received was one of the editors at our journal once said that he didn't like a particular stream of research even. He just thought it wasn't a healthy stream of research. But he still recommended that a paper in that area get accepted because within that community, it was accepted. Like, you know, and so then it's just basically, well, you know, I don't agree with that, but I'm willing for other people to agree with that and, you know, just live and let live. You know, that community can, as long as it's good work within that community, then it should be accepted. And so there's no monopoly on knowledge, right? It's not like your view is the only view. Okay. Yeah, I'll just go through the others quickly. Do not send the authors on a wild goose chase. Avoid Janus-faced assessment. Janus-face is, you know, in theatre where you've got the positive, the happy, the smile and the, you know, frown or whatever. So you don't say, oh, this is a great paper, et cetera, and then tell the editor, no, I think you should reject this paper, it's horrible. Or in grants, you know, you say these great things and then in your scores you give these terrible scores and stuff. So it's just, you know, don't be Janus-faced. Avoid springing avoidable surprises. So in a multi-round context, you don't want to be saying good things and say go in this direction and then later you reject a paper for things that you didn't say earlier or things you thought was a strength and then, you know, you later say as a weakness. You can't do this to authors. Be timely, you know, write the review you want to receive. I think these are all straightforward. The main thing is probably this, just write the review you would want to receive. So if you always try to review on that basis, you'll be a much better reviewer. Just a couple of questions that people often get. So reviewers, sometimes they just expect everything from an author. So it's as if you haven't thought of the author's space restrictions. Like the author only has this many pages. You can't get them to do everything. There may be no supplemental materials. At one of our journals for a while, the supplemental materials that went along with the paper became like a junkyard for every possible idea a reviewer ever had. Just run one more test, stick it in the supplemental materials. So, you know, we started putting pretty strict length restrictions on at the journal, saying no supplemental material, stuff like this, because that was what was happening. Reviewers were just asking for more and more things, and so we basically said, don't do that. Reminding reviewers not to put their decisions in reviews. We also brought in transparency policies in our journal, so you know, people should make their data available, their experimental materials available and so on, but they're not peer reviewed, so reviewers can give suggestions on them, but they're not reviewed, so that distinction was important. And then all the Gen AI stuff, like obviously not getting ChatGPT to write your review for you. I'll skip this, and I'll skip this as well. We can distribute the slides to you. The main thing, I'll go through these questions. The main suggestion, though, I would give on reviews is just simply spend time on them. So, like for a journal, how much time would you spend on a review normally? Like, can you just give me an estimate, roughly? Was well? Yeah, but you're not going to use all the 30 days, right? Yeah. So how many days would you spend normally? Or a week? During a review. Okay. So yeah, so that would depend on the conference or the workshop or the journal, right? So there might be a simple workshop where the review, you get it done within a couple of hours or something. You know, you read the paper and then write some comments. I would probably, in my early days at MISQ, I spent a week on a review. I definitely would have done that. But now I definitely would not do that. But I can't do a review for our journal. Probably, I've never managed it within a day. That's reality. Because I'm a slow reader, so it usually takes me at least a couple of hours to read the paper like once. And then I have to read it again, so that's like the morning gone. And then if there's papers I'm supposed to read to help me do the review, well, then that's the afternoon gone. And then I start writing my review, and I'm a slow writer, so I don't manage to finish that evening, and so then the next day I'm finishing off my review. So that's kind of how it works. But basically, the biggest issue with reviews is that people don't spend... The biggest problem with reviews is that people don't spend time on them. So some questions. How do I become a reviewer? So... Do you have, what do you think the answer to that would be? How do you become a reviewer of a good conference or journal? Publish, yeah. And what's another? So that's probably the best way. And what's the other best way?
Review more papers.
Yeah, you review well, but you need to become a reviewer first. So how do you? Yeah.
Ask your supervisor.
Yeah, so it's the networks, basically, yeah. So if you come from a good school, so UQ was another good school, where there are already people who are on track chairs of conferences or editors of journals, then you're sort of known, and then you do good work, so you write good papers or you do good things, then more people know you, and that's how you do reviews, yeah. So it's just the way it is. And then how long should your review be? That varies a lot by field. In our field, I'd say a really good review is around 3 pages. If you have a review that's like 6 pages long, then it's just like a long laundry list of a lot of irrelevant things, or they're pontificating about stuff, or they've kind of missed the point. If a review is only like 1 page long, in my field, that would be considered like you're a bit negligent. You probably haven't focused on enough things. So it often works out to about 3 pages. But I was on the editorial board of one journal, and they said it should be no longer than 2 pages. And that was kind of interesting. They put this maximum page length on reviews. But at some, I just did a grants thing this morning, and they had, I think, characters on the, so I was like counting the characters as I was typing. Anyway, obviously it varies by field. And then why did the editor overturn my decision? Or the editor's decision was opposite to mine. Was my review bad? So that's kind of what I talked about earlier with the quality of reviews and what your role is. It could be that that it is true that the editor made a different decision on the paper than you, and so your review did kind of miss the point. But it might be that your review was still helpful. It's just that the editor felt that the paper overall still makes a contribution or doesn't make a big enough contribution, so that your comments were still valid, but the editor was just looking at the paper from a different vantage point, and it just takes a while to kind of learn that. Also, just as a general thing, being the reviewer number 2 isn't always a bad thing. So I've had papers that I've had accepted where in the end I was grateful for the reviewer number 2, because the reviewer number 2 was pushing me to do things, and unless reviewer 2 had really done that, I wouldn't have done it in the paper. And I was glad when the paper was published that the paper had those things in it. So it was sort of a better paper. So that gets me to this point on responding to reviews. Krishna, you've seen these slides because I just went through them the other day, and you did too, so hopefully it's not too repetitive. There's lots of ways that you can respond to reviews, like when you're doing responses. So you may give formal responses, you may give proposals to editors. So you may say, hey, this is what we're planning to do with a revision, can you give us feedback? There may be informal things where you're just trying to interact with editors and get feedback. And then you may formally appeal like a decision, and I've actually never done that, but I've done formal proposals to editors, including asking for reconsiderations of decisions. So after this, I can, through Kate or somebody, I can distribute these papers. So I've got the review histories of these particular papers, and it may just be helpful for you to see kind of review packets and how the paper went and the responses and so forth. So these were some old papers I had accepted, and they had different journeys. So I guess the common lesson is that it's acceptance at the first journal. So a paper that just is submitted, goes through a few rounds and is accepted is sort of the minority of these cases. In the next one, it was actually rejected at a journal, but then later accepted at the same journal, and then accepted at a second journal after a rejection at a first journal. This is quite common. You send it to one journal, it doesn't work, you go to the next journal. And then the next one is it was rejected at the second one even, but then ultimately accepted there. So this one was where it was rejected at one journal, and then it went to another journal, and then it was rejected again. So we sent it to one journal called ISR, it was rejected. Sent it to another journal at MSQ, it was rejected again. But we wrote to the senior editor. So this is not the editor-in-chief. As I said, I haven't ever appealed to the editor-in-chief. But we just went to the senior editor who made the decision on the paper and said, hey, what have I written here? We respect your final decision, but we're writing to see if you might reconsider it for a few reasons. And we just said, essentially, that you'd said you were going to reject it because you didn't think we could do all the following things, but we think we can. Would you give us a chance? And we did that, and then ultimately the paper was accepted. And then this was a different version. So this one, it was rejected at the journal, called, MISQ. And then at MISQ, the editor said, look, I'm rejecting it, but you could give us a completely different paper, sort of connected to the same idea, but really revamp it, and we would be willing to look at it. And so that's what we did. We said, okay, thank you, we're grateful. You suggested that we draft a plan for discussion. Please find our plan enclosed. But then the response we got from that was kind of lukewarm. So we said, okay, well, we're going to just take it as a rejection and we'll send it to another journal. And then the paper was accepted a few rounds later. This one was rejected at one journal, and we then sent a proposal to the editor. We've said here, we outline what we believe were the major issues, how we think we can address them. You offered in your letter a reject and resubmit opportunity, noting that it would be a chance to completely rework your paper, resubmit it as a completely different paper. We're writing to explain why we think we can address the review team concerns and request your permission to keep the same. So essentially, we just, similar to the first one, said, would you give us a chance? And we'll see if we can do it. And then he said yes, and the paper was accepted a few rounds later. And so over the years, I've got a number of these lessons. So I've called them provide the forest and the trees, do more than they ask, leverage expertise, don't play reviewers against each other, argue politely, show that issues are deep and show that you're human, and that the aim is to have an impact. So I'll just go through some of these quickly. Provide forest and the trees. So in the reviews, I will always give the forest. So I'll have a page at the top. It's typically just one page. I try to keep it on one page that just says these are the things we've done in the revision. And so my main response document starts with this one pager, and it says, this is broadly what we've done. And then I give the trees, which is a table, and I just have comment, response, and then I put little numbers next to them. The reason I do the numbers is because it's easier later. Let's say reviewer 2 has some question, and so I say, the AE addressed that, please see AE point number 2. And so, they go see reference AE point number 2, rather than me just repeating everything again. And then for the verbatim ones, I do it completely verbatim, like every single thing that's in there, I just copy and paste. And some people like doing it paragraph, response, I have always done these tables, but it's the same thing. So I'll have the forest, the overall, and the trees. And when I started out, I didn't do the forest one. I didn't have this overall. And it was only when I was doing reviews of other people's papers and I saw one guy doing this and I was like, wow, that's a great idea. So I've just always done it since then. It is helpful. Then do more than they ask. So you can see here in my response, I've said to address the problems in the last version, we conducted a new experiment and a follow-up protocol study using stronger manipulations. Then in a conceptual paper, I said perhaps the most noticeable of our final changes was that, although not asked for, we felt we could improve our review. We carried out a more structured review and now report these results. So quite a common thing I can't do it always, but a common thing in responses is I'll try to think of something additional beyond what they've said me to do. It's just human nature, right? Like if someone does something more, then you'd be happier with them. So rather than do less or just meet, I try to think, what else can we do to, go beyond, in the spirit of their suggestions, but even more. So that would be something I try. Leveraging expertise. So I would frequently contact other people for their help when I do my revisions. So it's quite common in a craft or a guild or whatever that people will say, oh, you've misinterpreted so-and-so, or you haven't done this method as well as so-and-so, or whatever. So this is a social process, right? I can contact so-and-so and say, can we get your advice on this revision, because they've told us we've misinterpreted your theory and we'd really like some advice. So you can see here in this one on the left, we used a theory, one of the authors of this theory was a guy called Yair Wand. So we shared our revision with Yair. Not only did we do that, but we put that in the response, right? So we say, we shared this with Yair, we asked him to look at this, his edits are shown below, and I just copy and paste his comments in there. Or another example, I was using some psychological theories of a guy called Richard Mayer. I've never met Richard Mayer or Clark Chin, but I just contacted them. So I emailed them and said, the reviewers have raised questions about our use of your theory. Would you look at this, give us some advice on this? And so then I say, they suggested that the people doing the most relevant work is this, and then, what the different people and issues respond. So, it's a social process. You can contact people, you can put people's things in your responses. And, in the early days, I never thought to do that.
Quick question, when you are kind of leveraging other people's expertise, people that you haven't met, do you share your entire manuscript or do you highlight certain parts of it?
That's a good question. I have no problem sharing my manuscript. The problem is they won't read the whole thing, yeah. So it would depend on the case as to whether I shared my paper. What I can't do, I wouldn't feel comfortable sending the whole review packet because it's just sort of like this confidential thing. But I would definitely say the person has had questions or concerns about this bit, and I wouldn't mind putting a sentence or two from what they've said, because that's like, if I've misinterpreted something, those words might be quite helpful for me. Yeah. All right, and then don't play reviewers against each other. So what I used to do in the early days was I would see, reviewer 1 and reviewer 2 kind of disagree with each other. So I'll say to reviewer 1, I can't do what you said because reviewer 2 liked that bit. And so I'd sort of play them against each other. And then that generally doesn't work. So I won't bother going through this example, but essentially I was sort of like, the fact that these reviewers disagree with each other kind of indicates that this is a problem, and that's the problem we're addressing. So, the fact that they're disagreeing with each other is kind of shows why our paper is important. And the reviewer basically gets cranky when I try this strategy. So, in contrast to your inference, my views are not opposed to that of reviewer 2. The issue is to repeat. So basically I've just sort of unmoved the reviewer and just annoyed him or her that I was like playing this game. So yeah, don't play games. However, you should argue politely if you're right, so you don't always need to bend over backwards and just say, thank you for your wonderful comment. So you can just say, so you can see the way I've ended this. We remain confident in the validity of materials we used. In the earlier one, I've said, we believe that his concerns do not threaten the study's validity or the conclusions. We clarified the method section as much as possible. So I usually try to work in something about, you could say, we appreciated the reviewer's critique. So I'll try to say something polite, and I'll try to say something that we changed. We tried to clarify something, but I'll also say we remain confident, or that they don't affect the validity. So just being polite, but this is the same sort of stuff. I won't bother going through the example. One thing I often do is I will break up a reviewer's points into multiple subpoints. So I don't need to go through the details here, but just my strategy in the response is I've said there are 2 issues here. And then I go through each issue. It doesn't matter what the details are. All it matters is that I've said there are 2 issues. So the thing is that you spent 3 years on this study, and the reviewer might have spent the afternoon doing it. And so they've made a comment, and the issue is deeper than that. It's more so you should show that. And what I have generally found is the reviewers tend to back off, or at least they appreciate when I've been able to systematically show that I really understand these issues. There's different sub-issues, and this is why the issues are complex. And then they tend not to get further into the details. They tend to think, okay, yes, you've thought about those things. Or maybe there's only one of those, of the big issue, there's only one sub-issue, which is a problematic one. So to show that the issues are deep is important. And then showing that you're human. So I'll acknowledge errors or I'll ask for help. So I'll say, although we felt we'd used this theory correctly, it turned out that reviewer one was right. We'd failed to appreciate some distinctions. I'd ask for help. So I said, although I feel confident about my reading of this literature, I'm not deeply embedded in this other literature. So I shared my paper with several people. I feel my analysis is fair, but I'm interested in obtaining feedback from the review team. So, I'm just being honest and like I'm human, right? And sometimes you won't win. So, somebody was just, this is an editor writing to me, I'd just sort of done the revision badly, and sometimes, the next one is sometimes you do win. But, the impact, the aim is not to win. So I shared with a couple of the students here the story of my first publication. So at my PhD department, the way it worked was that you came in and you were assigned as a research assistant to people. That's the way the scholarship worked. So here, you come in with an advisor who's already done all the scholarship stuff for you, or that's how it often works here. But at my university, you came in the scholarships with the university, and then the university assigns you, or the department, they assign you to somebody. So I didn't know who I was going to be assigned. I was assigned somebody. The person gave me some data and said, look, I'd like you to try to publish this. So that was my job. And so I was like, right, I'm just going to do this. And I had no interest in the data and no interest in the topic, but I had been given my job to do, which was to get this thing published. So I crafted this narrative, I sent it to this journal, and my job was to win. Like, I was going to figure out how to say this paper made a great contribution, which I didn't even agree with, but that was what my job was. So I went through the review process and I won, like, acceptance. And then it's like, they're so embarrassing. Like, the paper is terrible and it's got my name on it. And so I was like, oh, that's horrible. Like, what do you do now? You can't do anything. So my first paper is like, I'm not even proud of the paper. You know what I mean? That's kind of horrible, but that's just the way it is. So it's that was my lesson in joining academia, that your name is on this thing. And you can't get it off, right? So it's just there now. Well, there it is, and it even has a poxy picture of me in the back with hair. But the aim is not to win, right? That's not the goal. And then you'll have these bad days. So this is stuff people have written about my papers. I'm bashing literature. Anyway, you can see. It's hard reading so many compliments, so much positive feedback. I hope this made them feel better about themselves, Anyway, then sometimes people write nice things too, but I don't need to share. So, anyway. Thank you. Any questions? Yeah.